Okay, now before we move forward, I just want to take a moment and say that if you are unhappy with what you have here, I would highly encourage you to just start over. I know that seems harsh, but I think it's very important as an artist to be just willing to kind of give up what you're working on and start fresh. Um, I think it's a real testament to your skills if you're willing to take what you have and scrap it and then just recreate it in a better way. You can't rely on luck for consistency. Sometimes we get lucky with things we're working on and it just turns out good. At least when you're first sort of getting better as an artist, you feel that sensation a lot where you're like, oh, I got really lucky there and this just turned out great. You shouldn't chalk it all up to luck. There's some skill involved in that, but you can't rely on luck for consistency. You need to rely on your artistic skills. And it's a true testament to your artistic skills if you're willing to just sort of give everything up and create it again. Your second attempt is always going to be better than your first attempt. Your third is always going to be better than your second attempt, and so on, right? The more practice you have, the better you're going to be. So chalk this up to practice. If you're not enjoying or if you don't like where it's at, chalk it up to practice and start over. Analyze your reference a little bit more. Maybe even go back and decide on a different car to do, right? But there is no harm, and in fact, it's even going to make you a better artist if you're willing to just start over from scratch and create it again even better. One of my favorite all-time quotes from Adam Savage of Mythbusters is that if you're going to make anything good, be prepared to make it 3 times. And I love that quote, and I sort of live by that. You can't be afraid of just scrapping it and starting over. So if you're unhappy with where you're at this point, if you notice that your surfaces just aren't very smooth and you feel like you can do better, I'll just say this, and then we'll continue on. As an artist, for me, the moment I feel like I can do something better, I try to do it better. I have had situations where I've modeled things to 90% completion and thought to myself, man, now that I have this practice, I could do this way better. And I do. I'll just scrap it and start over and just do it way better the second time, and it'll turn out way better. You can't be afraid of that. You can't look at this as a waste of time. You have to look at it as honing your artistic skills. So if at any point you just feel like you can do better with something, then actually do better with it, right? Don't say, well, I'll just do better with the next one. Either try to fix the issue that you're having or just scrap it and do it over again. So I really encourage you at this point, if you're early on at this stage and you're not happy with where it's at this early stage, you're only going to become better if you just start from scratch. Now, there is sort of like a point of no return eventually where you get to a point where like 75% of this is great, but this 20% of it I don't like. Well, just scrap that 20% and then just redo that 20%, right? You don't have to scrap the entire project, but if you look at it as little parts, right, there's nothing wrong with just like deleting that part and starting from scratch again. So I just really want to emphasize that you should not be afraid to just start over. Don't give up. Once you're a little bit more practiced, you'll just get better and better at it. So don't be afraid to start over. Now, with that said, we're going to continue on here. I'm going to draw out another profile curve to continue this little shape here. Now, this eventually sort of flattens out and curves up, right? So what I want to do to kind of just help me out here is I just drew a little edge loop right there. I'm going to delete it and just draw it again so you can see how I do this. So I'm just going to draw a little edge loop right around here. This is where everything just sort of evens out. And we can see if I look in my side view that this is actually up a little bit higher than this part. So we do want this to kind of curve up and even out into that shape. So just to help me out a little bit, I'm going to draw a little edge loop right here. Let's go ahead and just draw it halfway, or not halfway down. I'm going to go right about here. And then I'm going to take this edge and just extrude it straight out like that. This is just going to be my guide, so I know how high to put this, so it sort of rolls into that shape a little bit. I'm actually going to move it down a bit so we have more of like a natural curve as it comes down. All right, so that will give me a little guide. So whenever I extrude this line out here, let me make sure we got that right line for the profile curve. I can just go straight back, and that's too far back. And let's try to just kind of bring that up even with this little line right here. We can hit F on our keyboard to frame that up to get a very close-up view of that. And so I just kind of want to bring that as close to that line as I can. I'm going to leave a little bit of gap just in case, right? So then we will go into our top view and try to match this actual profile curve that we have here. So this is going to come all the way over here, right in this corner somewhere. And then this is going to kind of curve out a little bit. So again, with the multi-cut tool, I'm going to cut right down the center. And then we'll go to vertex mode and move that, curve that out a little bit. And let's try to keep the same amount of edges here and here. So we're going to keep this pretty simple. And we're probably going to redo this a little bit so our edge loops match up with the hood as well. So just a little bit of a profile there. And let's see, we'll do another little one. Actually, we'll just take this one that we have here and kind of even that out. I think that's probably going to be enough. Maybe I do want to add another little edge right there to be even with this edge. So let's go ahead and just put a slice right through all of these. And then I'll just kind of move these out a little bit. I don't want to go too far, right? I don't want this to curve out and then back in. What I like to do, this is a little trick, and I don't know if you can see it, but whenever my lines, my edges here have like this stepping pattern to it, that means it's curving outward, right? And we can see when it gets nice and straight, right? As I move this in, we're eventually going to get like an almost perfectly straight line. So that's the way that I tell if my lines are straight. And then I want to curve it in a little bit. So I'm just going to go in a little bit this way, right? So I have really long steps in my line, right? So that's just a little trick that I have where when I'm looking at my edges, I can kind of see how the angle of them by looking at actually using the aliasing of my edges to kind of gauge that. Right, and then we'll add another little cut right there. Kind of bring that over. Okay. And then from my side view, I want to make sure from my side view, this is going to be kind of hard to see, but I want to make sure that this is in my right position in the side view as well. I think this one's pretty good right here. And this one is probably okay where it's at as well. All right, so again, we can kind of check that out. Make sure that profile curve looks good. And now we're going to fill the gaps in between just with our bridge tool. So we're going to do bridge, bridge, And then let me add a little cut right there. Again, I always like to leave a gap before I connect it to my sort of profile shape. So we'll do another bridge. And what that gap allows me to do is just to create another edge loop right down the center. And then I can just kind of move that entire edge loop so it's sort of perfectly lined up with this shape here. So now that's curving up into that shape, right? Like that. And then I can fill this gap here with my bridge tool. And once again, after you create a shape like this, always check your highlights, right? Look at your highlights, make sure there's no lumpiness or anything like that. We don't want like really wobbly highlights. We want really nice and smooth highlights as we're checking our geometry. I find this is the key to getting really nice, smooth geometry, is really sort of relying on those highlights. All right. I also don't like modeling in smooth preview mode. I will use smooth preview quite a bit to check my smoothness and my highlights of my model, but I wouldn't recommend modeling with you when you have smooth preview turned on. Always set it to hard edges when you start modeling again. The reason for that is when you're in smooth previews, your vertices aren't always where you expect them to be. For example, if I select this vertex right here and I hit 3 on my keyboard for smooth preview, right? So my display is showing this vertex way over here, but my pivot point for that vertex is actually way over here. This is where that vertex is actually located. So it can be a bit misleading if you're modeling in smooth preview mode. So just, try to keep a habit of modeling not in smooth preview mode. And I think the other thing I'm going to do here is just delete this edge, because this will eventually kind of fade out and just become like a flat surface. And I'm not quite sure how I want to deal with that. Actually, I'll leave it for now, but I do, in my mind, I'm thinking I'm not quite sure how I want to deal with that. So, so we'll just leave it for now. Okay, so that is all looking pretty good. Now we're going to have a bit of an interesting problem, or a little bit of an interesting issue with getting this gap closed. Now I have sort of like an interesting way to do this, I guess, and we'll talk about it a little bit as we go. So basically what I'm going to do is take these two shapes. And again, I'm going to delete a lot of this stuff, but I want to overlap these shapes. This will be a technique that you see me using a little bit more. It's a little bit more of an advanced sort of workflow, I'm going to say, and it really requires you to be mindful of the edges and faces that you're going to make, because it's a little bit messy and it's going to need a little bit of cleanup. So I'll work you through it, but this is, really one of those things where you just have to be very mindful of what you're doing, or you'll end up with a lot of bad geometry if you're doing these sort of messy, weird techniques like this. So what I'm going to do is just extrude this out further, right? And again, this is going to look messy, right? And I'm just going to kind of extrude it out and have it continue with that edge profile. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this one. Probably just up to this point. I'm not going to worry about this one. but I'm going to extrude this out and kind of try to match it with this angle here. So let's look at this from our front view. And then I'll extrude it out again, just moving it in our front view. All right, so now I have these two shapes overlapping quite a bit. And now I need to kind of connect them up. So we have a problem with that, right? Our geometry doesn't quite match up the way that we want it to. So I'm going to need to add in an edge loop or move some edge loops around a little bit. So I'm going to need to move this edge loop up here and probably add an edge loop over here somewhere, and maybe even move this one up a little bit too. So rather than moving this around, which is going to mess up sort of our flow and smoothness of our shape, I'm not going to grab this edge and move it around. What I like to do instead is I'll add a new edge loop where I want it to be, and then I'll control delete the old one where I don't want it to be. Right, so now those line up just absolutely perfectly. And I actually want to move this one a little bit higher up. So I'm just going to kind of move this one a bit higher up. Same thing. I'm going to add the edge loop I want and then control delete the edge loop I don't. Very important to control delete here. If I just do delete, right, it leaves behind all of the vertices, and that creates n-gons and just messy geometry. So very important, control delete. And then I'm going to add another little edge loop right there to match that one perfectly. And then this one, I'm actually just going to kind of continue this one through to where it matches with that little edge loop right there perfectly. And then the rest of this area, I'll sort of figure out as we go. So now what I want to do in both of these is kind of cut a little line that matches the profile of these. And again, this is kind of an advanced technique here. So just be mindful of that, right? And it, it's going to be a bit messy as we go, but it will turn out with a good result, I promise. So from here, I want to kind of pick a distance. Now I do notice that this does kind of roll into this. It does kind of slope in. It's not a really sharp angle. It kind of slopes like this if we look at a reference. Right, so if I come in here and kind of look at this reference, it does kind of roll in and slope into this hood shape here a little bit. And it's not just like a sharp angle. So I do want to give it a little bit of a gap. So let's start right here with this corner. I'm going to grab my multi-cut tool. And I'm going to go right down to about right there. And I want to try to leave the same amount of gap all the way through. And what we're looking at here is not this line right here, but I'm looking at this gap where those two surfaces meet up. That's the gap that I want to try to get right. Right. And now this one, we're lucky enough where that kind of lands right there on that corner. And then this one, we're going to bring down, if we can, to try to be pretty much even with that as well. And then I can probably even just delete this edge. Okay, so now we have that sort of cut and matching perfectly with that edge profile. Now I'm going to cut another one with a little bit of a gap all the way down there as well. So we'll start right here where we can kind of connect up these two edges. And again, I'm looking at this line right here. I'm not looking at the edge. And I'm just going to try to leave a little bit of a gap there. This is where it gets a little confusing, right? Because it's hard to see where that gap is. And in this situation, it's actually going to cross over this edge loop, which is fine. Don't worry too much about that. We will clean it up. And then here it really starts to kind of fade out, so I'm not too concerned with that. So this is where I feel like this is where we really get into true modeling, right? We're not just using primitives. We're not just using extrude tools and bevel tools, right? We're actually physically creating geometry, deleting geometry, reconnecting up. This is where you get into the real nitty gritty of modeling, right? This is what a true modeler, 3D modeler does. This is what real 3D modeling is to me. So this is where we really get into some advanced 3D modeling. Okay, so then I'm just going to delete all of the overlap, right? So all the way down, I'm just going to delete all of that overlap for both of these. And what we're left with should be a pretty straight gap. Let's just go ahead and delete these two. It's just going to make life a little bit easier to kind of see what's going on. So what we're left with is a pretty evenly spaced gap all the way down that space. If we hit smooth, we can kind of take a look at that, right? It's a little wobbly right there in that one direction. I think we can probably get rid of this edge right now, Control Delete, just for the sake of our Ingon. And this, it kind of gets narrow right here. So what I want to do, again, instead of moving this vertice, what I want to do is I'm going to create a little bit more of a gap right there to kind of even that out. And then we're going to delete those. So now we have a little bit more of an evenly spaced gap all the way down. Again, it's fine to create ingons occasionally as you're working. Just kind of be prepared to go in and fix them. It is still a little bit off center, but let's go ahead and bridge these up and see how it looks. Right, so I'm just going to bridge these. Bridge. Whoops. And then we'll hit smooth and just see how that looks transition wise. I think it looks okay. I think it could be a little bit smoother. We'll try to fix that here in a moment. And I think, in fact, what I'm going to do is just take this edge and get rid of this completely if I can. I'm not sure, actually. Let's go ahead and delete this. So again, you'll start to see here that this is where there is no formula, right? There is no there's no correct way to deal with anything. We just have to kind of figure it out and be artists, right? There's no step-by-step process when it comes to a lot of this stuff. It's just using the tools in the best way that we know how to kind of solve these problems. Yeah, there is no real step-by-step process to this. So we just have to kind of figure things out as we go. Before I move forward, I'm going to go ahead and try to close this gap right here. So let's go and just bridge this one up. We have a little stray vert right here somehow. So I'm going to hit delete to get rid of that one. And it looks like there's another one really tied in here as well. So delete that one as well. And we'll check this for n-gons here in a second in non-manifold geometry. We also need to delete our history occasionally. So let's just kind of finish this up, and then towards the end of the video, we'll talk about some good housekeeping techniques. Right, so let's bridge these guys up. Another tool that I'm going to use, I haven't really used yet, but that is my target weld tool. This is where you just weld vertices together. So I'm going to grab my target weld tool, and I'm just going to weld this vertice up to that vertice like that. And then with this little triangle here, I'm going to select this, just one of the edges inside of that triangle, and go to Mesh, Fill Hole, and that will fill that in. And again, let's just take a look at how that transition looks overall. I think that looks pretty good. I think it could be a little bit of a softer, smoother transition so far, but I think for the most part that looks pretty good. Let's see, what I think I want to do with this edge loop, we have this triangle here. I'm going to try just kind of triangling this one off. Oops, like this. Control delete that, and then I'm just going to select that edge and just control delete that one edge, and that will leave us a quad right there. And again, I'm just looking at my highlight to see how smooth all of our highlights and everything look, and look pretty good. I do think it could be a little bit more spaced out, a little bit softer, especially right in here. So what I'm going to do to fix that is, once again, I'm going to take my multi-cut tool, and I'm just going to move, just going to make a new edge a little bit further out like this, that will eventually sort of meet up with that edge right there. And then I'll delete the one that we don't want. Let's see, I think I want to leave that one right there. So we just delete these two. And we will delete this one. And then I'm going to take my target weld and I'm just going to weld this one over here like that. And now let's take a look at that, see how that looks. That looks a little bit nicer. It's a little bit more of a smooth transition all the way up until right around here it starts to get really sharp. So we want to smooth out that sharpness. And I think I'm going to delete this edge right here. And let's go ahead and just bridge. Let's make our edge loop here just a little bit further down. And let's go ahead and bridge these two together. And then we'll figure out how to, I think I'm going to just delete this edge. Control delete. We'll target weld this one to that one. Whoops. Make sure when you use your target weld, you don't have something already selected. It can kind of mess you up. So we'll target weld this one to that one. And now these two are still not connected. I know if we hit smooth, we can see how weird our geometry is right there. So if I move this, oh, it actually is connected. Okay, so happy accident. I do see a little floating. There's one of our floating polygons there we can get rid of. And let's see, I don't like this. So let's make a triangle going all the way to this. And then probably triangle to this one. Again, I don't know how this is going to look, right? I'm just kind of playing it by ear and trying to do the best I can with these surfaces. And then we'll draw a triangle up to this one. We're eventually going to subdivide all of this. So it's going to look a little bit more along the lines of what we have here. But we want to try to block out those shapes with really smooth lines and transitions first. All right, so I think what I want to do here is I want to take this curve coming up here and kind of curve it in. Again, this is where we're really getting into what I would consider polymodeling, right? So if this is a bit confusing for you, you're in the thick of it now, right? So this is where you become an actual modeler, is where you're starting to do stuff like this and think about stuff like this. So I'm gonna move this curve over, and again, we're gonna delete it where we don't want it. Right, I'm mainly just trying to soften this little crease right here so this starts to look kind of flat. And that might be something we have to deal with a little bit later. Let's see if we just get rid of that and make that an n-gon. It does start to flatten out a little bit right there. So I think this is something that we can kind of just leave it for now. And if we have to tweak it later on, we can kind of tweak it a little bit later on when we have the rest of this shape. But overall, I think that's looking pretty good so far. There is one little thing I want to fix right here. We have this little n-gon right here. So before we jump into the next video, in the next video, we'll talk about just cleanup, right? A way to kind of clean up our geometry as we go. But I do want to fix this little n-gon right here. And I think what I want to do with this is I have this edge loop right here. And then I have this edge loop right here. And what I want to do is figure out a way I can make this edge loop continue off into here. So, and then I'm kind of going to want to do that same thing for this one. So we'll talk about that one too. So to do that, I'm going to need to delete some. So I'm going to take, and again, I'm doing this in kind of a messy way, but I'm just going to try to reroute this geometry to something like this. And we'll probably need to leave another little n-gon for now, but let's use our target weld, kind of weld these together now. And this will be an issue that we'll just come back to later. But now I have an edge loop that goes all the way, it actually wraps all the way around and back here. And what I'm eventually going to want that to do is, instead of, I want it to wrap around there and then come back up here and then this way. And the other little thing that I'm noticing here that I don't really like is how this kind of is messy looking, how this geometry right here is kind of messy. So I'm going to fix that really quickly as well. And it's super easy to do. I'm just going to, again, we'll draw the geometry we want first. So I'm just going to do something really messy like this first. And then we get rid of the geometry we don't want. Right, so something like that. And same thing for this one. To clean that up a little bit, I'm just going to kind of do something like that. delete those, and then just take a look at it. Smooth. There's a little bit of a funky crease right there. I think what we can do for now actually is just get rid of this and just leave that as a triangle. And I think that's absolutely fine. There's still a little bit of a crease there, but we'll deal with that later if we think it's important. But for now, I think this is overall a pretty good shape. Okay, so next we're just going to talk about some cleanup we can do as we're working. So the first thing is to always delete your history. You can see that I already have quite a bit of history here. As you go, this just causes issues with modeling. Now, you normally want to be careful with deleting your history if you're doing anything like animation or anything dealing with dynamics. But when you're just modeling, you want to just constantly be mindful of your history and delete it. Your history is basically every action that you do. So every action that I've done so far, from poly split, which is our multi-cut tool, to bridge, extruding, every single, even moving a vertice, which is tweak, every single action that we've done so far is being saved, right? And eventually these build up, really kind of slow down our processes and our workflow. So we constantly want to just delete our history as we're modeling. This is a very important thing. So to do that, you can do that a couple different ways. If you go to your Poly Modeling Toolkit, you can see delete history right here, delete by type history. You just select your model in object mode and then delete your history. You can also go to edit, delete all by type history, and that will delete the history for everything in your scene, which can be important if you're modeling a lot of different objects and you just want to delete the history for all of them. But again, be careful with this if you're doing anything like animation or dynamics or deformers. Maybe try non-deformer history. But you want to sort of continuously delete your history. The other thing is freezing transforms. Now, currently, I have no transforms here. Everything's sort of zeroed out. I'm going to go ahead and freeze them anyway. So you can do that here by clicking this little snowflake. Or you can go up to modify freeze transformations, and that will freeze your transformations. And that will essentially give you just like a clean mesh that you're working with at this point. So the next thing I like to do is, as you're working, you'll see that if we're looking at this in non-smooth mode, we get this weird sort of like faceting and tessellation happening. This is just due to our normals. Now, the way that I like to deal with my normals as I'm modeling is I actually harden all of my normals. So I'll go to Mesh Display Harden, just with my entire object selected, Mesh Display Harden. Now, this is sort of personal preference, but as I'm modeling something like this, I just like to harden all of my normals. This gives me a way to kind of see my geometry, see my edge flow and everything, just by looking at the highlights. And then if I want to look at how everything's going to look when it's smooth, is I'll just hit 3 on my keyboard and we'll look at it in smooth mode, and that smooths everything out. So I just, as a habit, I will harden everything as I'm modeling. Eventually at some point I'll smooth everything, but just as I'm in the process of modeling stuff, I'll go through and smooth it out. The other thing that we want to do is make sure that we keep track of all of our ingons and non-manifold geometry. So to do that, we're going to use a function called Mesh Cleanup. So I'm going to select my object. I'm going to go to Mesh Cleanup, and let's go to Mesh Cleanup Options. And by default, these are the settings by default. So cleanup matching polygons, and that's it. These are the settings that I encourage you to use. instead of choosing clean up matching polygons, choose select matching polygons. If you allow Maya to clean up your polygons, it will do a lot. It oftentimes can mess up your geometry. It will clean up your n-gons, but it will also leave you with just like a messy piece of geometry. So I don't want Maya to clean up my polygons. I want to choose how to clean them up myself. So instead, I'm going to choose select matching polygons. I'm going to choose faces with more than 4 sides. That is my n-gons. And then I'm going to choose lamina and non-manifold geometry. So select matching polygons, faces with more than 4 sides, lamina, non-manifold geometry, clean up. And what this will do is select any problematic polygons. Now, you notice here that there's a few little these green verts right here. You can ignore those for now. If they're green verts, you can ignore them. That's just indicating there's something wrong with your UVs, and we haven't even touched UVs yet. So we're not worried about that. But this one is obviously an n-gon right here, and we're going to deal with this one later, so I'm not really worried about it at the moment. But what I like to do is I like to make 2 materials. So I will have my basic material here. So let's right click and go to material attributes. And this is my open PBR surface 1. So we'll just name this one car matte OPBR. For you name it whatever you want, just as long as it's something that you know what it is. Car matte OPBR. Right? And then I'm going to make another material. So we'll go to mesh cleanup again, make another material, and I'm going to right click this material this face right here and go to assign favorite material, and we'll create another open PBR surface, and I'm going to make this red, right? And I'm going to name this n-gon OPBR. Right, so as we're modeling and we do that mesh cleanup, like say for example, I have an n-gon right over here. So like if I grab this, delete that edge, so that makes this an n-gon, right? So as we're modeling and we run mesh cleanup, so I go to mesh cleanup, I can then immediately just right click, assign existing material, and do n-gon OPBR. And that will make it red, right? So that way I can kind of keep track of my n-gons as I go. Now in this case, I'm just going to reassign all the basic material because I only have one n-gon and I know exactly where it's at. So I'm not worried too much about it. And let's go ahead and delete these edges that we made. It's a little tiny one in there, right? And from here we can continue modeling. So again, that is how to just kind of keep track of your n-gons and clean them up as you go. And before we jump to the next video, let's go ahead and do a little bit more work on this. I'm going to bring this up. So we're probably going to need to add another little edge loop right here. And I'm actually going to delete this edge loop. And I'm going to take these 3 edges and we'll just extrude them straight back like this. And maybe move them up a little bit. Carefully try to just get them, for the most part, even. Doesn't matter if they're a little off, it's not a big deal. And then I'm going to use my target weld tool and weld this vertice to there and this vertice to there. We're going to kind of trend this all, so I'm not too worried about it looking perfectly beautiful. Want to kind of even out that slope a little bit though. And once again, we're going to take a look at it in our smooth mode. Look at our highlights. There's still a little bit of a crease right there, but we're going to fix that. Not too worried about that. But again, let's look at all of our highlights. I think everything is looking pretty good so far. There's a little bit of a dent right here. I'm not too worried about that because if we look at our reference images, find one, we have this sort of vent right there. So that's going to hide a lot of the little imperfections right there in that area. So I'm not super worried about that little dent. And we also, it's going to curve up quite a bit here as well. So I'm not too concerned about that. I do want to kind of trim this. So we're going to jump into our top view here. And I want to try to trim this. This is where it starts to slope up quite a bit. So I'm going to take my multi-cut tool and I'm going to try to trim this part here to kind of match that edge profile a little bit. So we're going to have to zoom in really tightly here for some of this stuff. This one's straight, so let's start here. And I'm just trying to match this curve with the edge that I'm making here. I want it to be a fairly smooth curve. Right, something like that. And now I'm going to delete the faces that are left over. I can get into face mode. Right, I think that's pretty good. Maybe go a little bit further down, actually. Let's go in this direction this time. Whoops. I think I'm just going to leave it the way it is. I think that's pretty good. That's close enough. I don't want to get too sort of meticulous about things. It's important to have an attention to detail, but a lot of this stuff doesn't need to be that precise. We're still going to have to kind of deal with this little crease coming through, and that's probably going to be moving our edges apart a little bit. We can probably start to do that a little bit now. I think what I'm going to do is make a new edge loop all the way down here, just a little bit further. And we're going to control delete that edge loop. And let's just try something here. Let's take this one and kind of have it triangle off into this one over here, something like that. And then we'll just delete this one altogether. See how that looks. Now that's smoothing out to much more of a flat surface. We still have some weird stuff right here, some weird pinching right here, but we're going to have an opportunity to fix all of that when we kind of make our seams and stuff. So I'm just going to kind of even this edge out a little bit more, so it just has a little bit more of a nicer flow to it by creating a new edge and then deleting the old edge. And a lot of this stuff we're going to just come back to and try to figure it out at a later time when we have a little bit more geometry to work with. I think that's a very important point to note, is if you do kind of run into issues with working with, right now we're still working with pretty minimal geometry. So if you do run into issues like this where you have weird pinching and stuff, just kind of make a mental note of it, and you can always come back to it later and start to work on this stuff a little bit later. Now let's do one more thing before we end this video. This is a quick one, basically just about fixing or finding and fixing non-manifold geometry in n-gons. Let's go ahead and mirror this over. Now there is a mirror function in Maya. I don't like using it personally. I like using an instance instead. It's just a little bit more non-destructive, I guess. It just kind of gives me a better control over what I'm doing. Sometimes using mirror can do some weird things. I don't like using symmetry in Maya. In other apps, I do like using symmetry, but I don't like doing it in Maya so much. Instead, what I'll do is I'll just mirror my geometry. And how we're going to do that is we want to change our pivot point to the center of our model. So I'm going to hold down D, which will move our pivot point around. And I'm going to hold down V, which turns snap to point on. And so with D and V held down at the same time, I can then grab my pivot point here and move it to a center point, one of these center points here, right? So that puts my pivot point in the center of my object. You can also put it in the center of your grid if you want, if that makes things a little bit easier for you. What you can do is turn on grid snapping right here, snap to grid, and then you can hold down D, which again changes your pivot point, and then you can just move that pivot point to the very center of your grid, and that way you know for a fact that you're in the true center of your scene, and when you mirror, it will mirror over correctly. And then what we're going to do is select our model. We're going to go to Edit, Duplicate Special. Make a mental note that that is Control-Shift-D, because you'll be doing this a lot. You'll be duplicating this over a lot because it's just the process that we're going to be using. So Control-Shift-D. We're going to look at the settings. We're going to create an instance. Actually, let's reset our settings here. So reset. We're going to create an instance, and I'm going to change my scale to -1x. Right? So that's the red axis here. That is my X direction. And duplicate special. And now we'll get two sides there. Now at some point I may lose my duplicate, right? And it goes away. In which case I can just select my model, Control-Shift-D, and then I have my instance again. And anything I do to one side gets done to the other side. Right, let me turn grid snapping back off. Right, so this basically just creates like a ghost image of my model. Right, so as I'm working, from time to time, this one will disappear. In that case, you could just do Control-Shift-D and get your instance. I like using this method way more than symmetry. A lot of times with symmetry, if you're getting really close to the center, it will merge your edges over, which is not something that you want. And it can just kind of lead to other issues as you're working. So it is good for some things. I do use it occasionally on simple shapes. But if you're doing anything more complicated, make sure you do this method and not symmetry. The one last thing I'm going to do here is go to vertex mode, and I'm going to grab these and just kind of move them out so they kind of just meet up at the center like that. This is also something that needs to flatten out as we get to this part up here, which we'll also sort of talk about that in a future video as we work forward. But so far, I think what we have is looking pretty good. We will continue on in our next video, just building out our primary form, our primary shapes. We do have some n-gons located throughout our geometry, but we have a mental note of where those n-gons are, and we're going to fix them at some point. But this is a really good start for our car model so far.